Thanks so much, David. We are very fortunate to have today Professor S. David Mitchell with us. Um, uh, some of you have heard him before. He has spoken to Muleskinners before, but I know that there are people in this audience who were not present the last time he spoke. That was several years ago now. So let me tell you just a little about him. Professor Mitchell is an interdisciplinary scholar who examines the criminal justice system using a sociological lens, specifically focusing on collateral consequences of sentencing, ex-offender reentry and reintegration, and felon disenfranchisement. I'm sorry, disenfranchisement. Dr. Mitchell joined the University of Missouri School of Law faculty in 2006. He is also an affiliate faculty member of the MU Black Studies Department and the Kinder Institute on Constitutional Democracy. In addition, he serves as a graduate faculty member in the Department of Sociology. Professor Mitchell has served as chair of the University of Missouri System Task Force on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and on the University of Missouri Faculty Advisory Council for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. He is a member of the American Law Institute and a member of the Missouri State Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, serving as chair of that commission in 2016. He has also been recognized for his teaching and service with several campus and other awards. Most recently, he was honored with the Missouri Lawyers Media Diversity and Inclusion Award. How he finds time to do all of this, I have no idea, but we're very happy that he's found time to talk to us today. So, Professor Mitchell, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about a topic that is part of my scholarship, and has now been thrust into the public conversation in ways that is rather bizarre and quite unique, given the fact that it's a theoretical framework that's been in existence for over 30 years now. And so I guess for academics, we're like, hey, it's fantastic, right? Someone's actually talking about us. The problem, of course, is the manner in which they're talking about us. So I'm happy to sort of talk about critical race theory, and certainly, hopefully, you will have some questions of me, and I will be able to engage with you in a little Q&A. So I'm going to talk about critical race theory. I'll talk about the history, the theoretical frameworks, and the criticisms that it's currently facing, to get an idea or sense of what it really is. So critical race theory sprang up in about the mid-1970s with the early work of Professor Derek Bell, Professor Alan Freeman, and Professor Richard Delgado. These three individuals, they came together and they were distressed at the pace of racial reform in the United States. They thought that, in effect, while the civil rights movement had made some significant advances, it had stalled. And quite honestly, while there were many gains, things were being rolled back, right? And the idea was, quite simply, while we had been moving forward, we had sort of stopped, right? We had engaged with legislating out certain acts that were illegal, that were that were discriminatory, and yet we still weren't moving fast enough. And we can sort of take a look at that today, quite honestly, when we look at the rollback in cases like Shelby, the Shelby case, removing the pre-clearance requirement, right? Looking at the current voting rights restriction cases that the Supreme Court has approved as being efficient and effective, that this is, quite honestly, and for those of us who study in the area, you know, we have never really ended the civil rights movement. We have entered maybe the second stage of it, or the second phase, and yet it's still ongoing. And yet we now are entering, in, quite honestly, a resurgence or a renaissance, if you will, of the civil rights movement. So recognizing the fact that we hadn't moved as far as we thought we had, that we had not gone or achieved what we had set out to do, these scholars came together and they recognized the fact that we needed to have a new approach to evaluating and to assessing and to addressing what were deeply entrenched varieties of racism. Right? It was very easy for us to look at the de jure forms of racism, segregation, discrimination, and to address those laws. Right? It was very easy for us to move when we're talking about from Dred Scott to Plessy versus Ferguson to Brown versus Board of Education to remove those legal barriers that existed. The problem was that while you can mandate legal change to address discrimination from a legal perspective, the issue was looking at, or the notions of racism that were embedded in the sort of societal structure, right? We can all take a look at the fact that you can have Brown versus Board of Education and the Civil Rights Movement concurrently with an entire framework of Jim Crow, right? That you can have them hand in hand at the same time, that you can have fundamentally the removal of slavery with the 13th Amendment, yet it's still not a total removal. Why? Because of course we have involuntary servitude that's embedded in the 13th Amendment with respect to incarceration and so forth. And so we have this interesting perspective of de jure removal of legal forms, and yet at the same time, concurrently operating, we still have other forms that are sort of deeply embedded. And that's just sort of the legal framework. Moving beyond that, of course, recognizing other areas of life and existence as to where we have these sort of perspectives. And so critical race theory says, let's take a look at this perspective from a new perspective. I'll make a little comment on the notion of what I find very curious about critical race theory and the current critiques about it. If you are an African-American child and you take a history class, or you've taken a history class, in the absence of critical race theory having a critical look, you would think that there was no advanced civilization on the continent of Africa. You would think that Black ancestors were merely brought here as property, existed as slaves, and were then freed with no precursor history. Right? Now, interesting enough, we don't sort of talk about the way in which we frame the historical framework, but critical race theorists do that. They look to say, what is it that we are actually, if you will, propagating with respect to history? History is often written by the winners. History is written by often the oppressors or powerful groups. And so part of it is looking beyond that. So critical race theory did not just exist out of whole cloth, right? Derek Bell and Richard Delgado did not come down from the mount with two tablets that indicated what critical race theory were, right? They were not the Moses of this theory in this framework. Critical race theory has very specific predecessors. Critical legal studies, which actually focused on the concepts of legal indeterminacy, which says quite simply that there is no singular or correct outcome for every single case. That if you are invoking this notion, if you're looking at case and judicial analysis, that you can see fundamentally that based upon the precedents you use, the perspective you engage will determine the nature of the outcome of a case. Case in point, you have an entire framework of judicial scholars who talk about originalism, who talk about the fact that the Constitution, as it was written, so shall it be interpreted and applied, and therefore it is not a living, breathing document that grows and sort of changes. I am not an originalist, and the reason why is because half of the population was considered to be property, and this is about women, not even African Americans. All right, they were paternalistic, they didn't have a vote, and others were clearly seriously property. They didn't have a voice at the table. When the document was created, there were a whole lot of people who were excluded from the room. And so I find the notion around originalism to be false, right? But there are others who think that. But critical legal study says, let's take a look at that perspective. And so if I'm looking back and I claim myself to be an originalist, I can have a particular outcome with respect to a particular case and jurisdiction. The other sort of predecessor, if you will, to critical race theory was radical feminism. The idea of looking at the power structure of women and the relationship between men and women in society throughout time and recognizing the fact that there was clearly a differential basis. Right? So critical race theory was, and this is what I find rather somewhat disingenuous and quite honestly quite laughable about the critique is, critical race theory is not the first theory to address the inherent flaws that might exist in our legal structure and system. Right? It is the one that invokes race, and that, of course, is the lightning rod. That is what has caused the problem. We have looked with critical legal studies. We have looked with radical feminism. We have looked with continental social and political philosophy to address where we have not been accurate to the founding documents. And yet none of those have come under the degree of scrutiny and vitriol as critical race theory has recently. And I'll sort of get to the reasons why I think that in a moment. So those are the theoretical predecessors, but of course there are sort of intellectual roots that are here that are embedded in this theoretical framework. The first is you've got, Dr. King, of course, the American Civil Rights Movement, Rosa Parks, W.E.B. Du Bois. You've also got those who are in the Latino Civil Rights Movement, right? We're talking about sort of Cesar Chavez and others. And so you have a full framework of individuals who are addressing individual and collective civil rights. You also have embedded in this theoretical framework a nationalist movement, right? Malcolm X, the Black Panthers, looking to what Black nationalism is and the idea that a nation formed around a group that has been oppressed, how do you free those individuals fully? Critical race theory, its historical roots, takes into consideration all of these particular pieces, right? All of these ingredients, and comes up with a framework itself to address this. And it comes into fruition in about 1989. The first real conferences around the creation of critical race theory was just about 30 years ago. It's not an old theory. And yet even within the theory, there are tenets, there are believers of it who range in terms of their movement. Really hardcore adherents to the theoretical framework are activist scholars who look at talking about the nature of the system itself and what does it look like and how do we engage in issues of equality and liberty, and others who use it to engage in analysis and examination, okay? So with that being said, the theory itself, right? There are some sort of basic insights that are involved with the theoretical framework. So for those who believe in, or sort of the initial sort of founders of this movement, right? And you can look at Delgado, you can look at Kimberly Crenshaw, Marie Matsuda, Charles Lawrence, to name a few others, that it studies and it seeks to transform the relationship among race, racism, and power, including economics, history, context, group and self-interest, as well as feelings and the unconscious, that all this is embedded in this notion of what critical race theory is and should be. In this same thing, critical race theory, as it's born, was born as a legal doctrine, as a legal theoretical framework. It was born in law schools by law professors. It has now migrated to other academic disciplines, education, psychology, history, and others, to examine the frameworks around which they engage in theoretical frameworks. But even when you think about that, right, the idea is that it's not an embedded theoretical framework that has now dominated or replaced or supplanted other theoretical frameworks. What I also find very curious is no one has ever questioned why has there been a singular existence of other theoretical frameworks that have not challenged racial hierarchies, that have not challenged gender hierarchies in other disciplines, and those have gone by the wayside, right? We've been very silent on that. The basic insights. So the first basic insight is the following. Racism in American society is normal and it is not an aberration. I'll just let that drop for a moment, right? Racism is a normalized power function in the United States and it is not an aberration. It's ingrained in and it appears ordinary and natural to persons in American culture. So formal rules of equality and opportunity insist on treating Blacks and whites alike. They can only address the most shocking and egregious forms, right? That's the de jure forms, right? That's what you sort of get with how do you address equality and so forth. So de jure segregation, Black personhood versus property, but it doesn't do well with issues around business as usual forms of racism that people of color face every day. And all we have to do is just pick up look on a single website, a single news item about the tsunami of Karen events around the country, right? That in effect, bird watching while Black, sitting in a coffee shop while Black, selling water while Black, walking while, pretty much anything while Black is the insidious non-de jure pieces that critical race theory seeks to unravel and unveil. Now, one of the critiques of this, of course, is, and I'll go into some of the criticism later, is individuals who sit in places as I do, Cori Bush, President Obama, right? Individuals say, well, how can you claim that there is a systemic function of racism in the United States when you have succeeded? Individual representation is not the same thing as systemic institutional precepts that address larger group dynamics, right? So the first thing is racism is normal and not an aberration. Secondly, the social world with its rules and practices and assignments of prestige and powers is not fixed. It is socially constructed. Power changes, both over time and access. Now, with that being said, I am a heterosexual male who's African-American. I have power dimensions along gender and where I sit as a law professor along socioeconomic status. And yet when you add race in there as intersectional in that piece, that changes the potential outcome. As I tell my students on an annual basis, I have a JD, I have a PhD. When I get in my car and I'm driving on the road, I'm a Black man in America. It doesn't say where I work, who I am, the degrees I've earned. This is the piece that critical race theory seeks to address. It also seeks to address the way in which race changes the very nature of our interactions. How many of you consider before you go shopping what clothes to wear? How many of you consider when you're in a store and you pick up an item what to do? As a young child, the very lessons taught were, if you go into a store, do not pick anything up and move it towards your pockets. Be very clear as to where you are going, recognizing where you are walking. How many walk to their office, to their parking lot at night from their office, recognizing who's walking in front of them and how they may react? These are all things that are part of my daily consciousness. And as the father of a 13-year-old son, part of what I address. That is the critical race theory pieces that can't simply be legislated away. That's not the legal aspects, right? So it's socially constructed. This is the social construction of the world. Third insight that critical race theory raises is interest convergence. So this was developed by Derek Bell, Professor Bell, and this concept holds that white elites will tolerate or encourage racial advances for Blacks only when such advances also promote white self-interest. Biggest, of course, affirmative action was a boon to white women in America. It helped extremely. Affirmative action has now done what it's done, at least its job for some would say that it's concluded, and it's moved. Interest convergence is diversity, equity, and inclusion as a mantra, as a framework, works in industry because it doesn't just address racial inequities or racial reparation, but it also deals with gender inequality. And it goes a step further, right? That in effect, you can take a look at this and say, by ethnic groups, for Latinos, and for Asians as well, it is beyond that. So, but in this context, interest convergence by Derek Bell was about how, in effect, you engage with Black Americans, elite whites, and so forth. And so the idea, liberal progressives who often sort of pat themselves on the back about how progressive they are, the question then becomes, well, how progressive are you really? Are you willing to have Black families move in your neighborhood? Are you willing to engage in further, if you will, issues of equality if it might impact your own life? There's a great podcast, if you haven't heard it yet, about some parents at a school in Brooklyn, New York, and about how they fundamentally changed the nature of the school itself with their desires. Now, their desires were having an excellent program for their children who happened to be white. They were gentrifying a neighborhood, and they were basically, dispossessing the individuals of color who lived there, and they weren't seeing the impact of what their actions were doing. They were creating advanced classes that they were excluding students of color and creating a bifurcated educational system when their intent was about creating and improving the system itself, right? This is the interest convergence issue here that sort of plays itself out. The fourth thing that critical race theory raises is this notion of different racialization or intersectionality. So you have heard, I'm sure you've heard the phrase these days have been uttered about creating minoritized communities. And the idea that it's about taking a group or individuals and you move them from a status in which they may be neutral as racial groups or neutral as ethnic groups, and they have now become racialized. The very interesting thing is that the racialization is always in comparison to African Americans in this notion of if you are viewed closer to that group, you are viewed more outside of the mainstream, you are viewed as quote unquote lesser than in some respects. And so the idea becomes you racialize different groups in a variety of ways. Also this notion of the intersectionality, which is why you will hear members of the LGBTQI community say they patterned their civil rights movement off of the African-American civil rights movement, right? The idea is that the framework is very similar, but it's the racialization, which is the exclusion, in other words, in many respects, of other groups that exist. The last sort of insight for critical race theory is this notion of that voices of color, people of color have a unique voice in this context. Sort of this legal storytelling, if you will. And you can sort of look at the framework of the indigenous, you can look at the framework of African Americans, you can look at the framework of Hispanic students, of Hispanics, Mexicans, you look in the framework of individuals across the racial spectrum, across the ethnic spectrum, and that we have created, if you will, a multitude of issues. When you look, and then when you sort of unpack that and look within certain groups, you will see a racialization that exists there. The color complex, the color line in Hispanic communities, right? From those who are light-skinned to darker skinned. The recent musical by Lin-Manuel Miranda of In the Heights came under a very serious critique for the lack of dark-skinned Hispanics in a particular neighborhood, which I believe just south of in New York City, in Washington Heights. But that's very present, not to mention the issue of the racialization within ethnic Asian communities, who is placed in a certain hierarchy. So critical race theory looks at this. Now, critical race theory as applied references, of course, the American experience. It looks at African Americans in this context, but then folks have taken it globally. And you can look at critical race theory in places like South Africa, clearly, right, in other parts of the world. Now, what you have, of course, is that there were some, of course, in the movement who are just as progressive minded, who are Latinos, LGBTQI, who recognize the fact that critical race theory is based upon a binary of Black and white. That's the paradigm. And they felt as though those pushes were discriminatory, or it lacked, if you will, a broader or expansive view of how do you sort of get rid of anti-discrimination laws, right? So now you have a Latino critical movement, actually. You have Lat Crit studies. You also have LGBTQI critical studies, right? All of which look at the way in which we address the nature of power and relationships in the United States that are often embedded in our institutions and our laws that deal with those outside the framework. And so critical race theory is on the continuum of critical legal studies, radical feminism, and it's also progeny now with Latino studies, LGBTQI studies. And so, once again, I find it very odd that we have pulled out critical race theory as the aberration, if you will, the anomaly in a bank, in a buffet of theoretical frameworks. All right. Criticism that have come back from this are critical race theorists. One of the things was they recognized the fact that the way in which we engaged in legal scholarship was not only predetermined, but actually played itself into, if you will, the exact same racialized framework, right? And so one is that they engaged in using storytelling, right? Folks felt, however, that storytelling, the critique was that these stories were somehow problematic because they can be employed in different ways. Although as a sociologist, I'm a qualitative sociologist, I use ethnography. Storytelling, if you will, gives context that cannot be seen just in data points. And it offers, if you will, a fuller version of stories that exist that go beyond the simple numbers. And so if I said to you, yes, we have removed any kind of barriers with respect to where someone can live in Columbia, Missouri, for example, then you would say, okay, well, look at the numbers. Yes, there's no de jure segregation. But if you unpack that and say, well, now let's see, where are people living? Why and how is it that they can or cannot live there? Some would go back to issues of redlining, restrictive covenants, and then even further to issues of economics, social context, interest convergence, to unpack, in effect, what is a framework of a potential exclusion. The second critique, that's often layered, sort of lobbed, if you will, at critical race theory is that folks said that race crits are too negative and that the despairing images of racial progress and regress offers little hope itself. So this is the sort of, I think, the current, if you will, mantra that's being laid out. The idea that critical race theorists are teaching white children, one, to engage in self-hate, that two, they are teaching white children to hate their country, and that three, they're teaching them that in effect, our country has never done anything, quote unquote, great. The problem with this is as follows. The very idea that you can be critical of an institution means that you are teaching someone to hate the institution is flawed, right? Merely because I critique something doesn't mean that I don't appreciate it. And it also doesn't mean that I don't want it to get better. I have student evaluations at the end of every semester. The mere fact that they critique me, does that mean they hate me? Well, some of them might, I don't know. But does it mean that they, in effect, I'm trying to get better, right? I'm trying to do better, right? The mere fact that we are engaging in a critical analysis of the documents and the founding of our country and who we are as a nation doesn't mean that we don't believe in the promise of the country or the principles that exist. But we recognize the reality is that we have yet to live up to it. One of our current senators has proposed a new bill called the Love America Act. And quite honestly, this is sort of farcical because the idea here is that we already teach everything that this act actually says in history classes. But I would propose the counter proposal to say is, if you are saying that critical race theorists and those who believe in this context or the groups who follow that don't love America, then how is it that they, in effect, fought for a country and a nation's ideals when they were less than full citizens? That they stood on the battleground to defend principles that failed to recognize them as full citizens back at home. That is actually loving America far more so than this idea of teaching about what we have done. We are a flawed nation, right? We are a young nation. Some would say we're still a teenager kind of nation, and teenagers are clearly flawed, right? You make mistakes and you sort of address those issues. The last thing is that the critique often, other critiques are that critical race theory, quote unquote, plays fast and loose with the truth, and that the race card is often played, right? And you see this no better than in the O.J. Simpson trial, folks saying, oh my goodness, the race card was being played in order to get him off because people are tugging at the heartstrings. It's about emotion, not about facts. And you look at a criminal justice system, and this is sort of my area of expertise, that is fraught with racial injustice from its beginning. I teach criminal justice administration, and the first case that I address is the Scottsboro Boys case, right? 9 young men who were sentenced to death on a rape that wasn't committed, and that took years in order for an exoneration. I look at the nature of the disparity with respect to mass incarceration. I look at the disparity with respect to crack cocaine and powder. The mere fact of how we treated different drugs with respect to crack cocaine, methamphetamines, and opioid addiction is an indication, therefore, of how critical race theory would say, what is the context here? What is the history here? What are we looking at to unpack what may be the embedded features of racism that exist in order for us to unpack? So I'll sort of wrap up and sort of open it up for Q&A. Critical race theory is not about self-hate. It is not about disparaging. It is not about creating a framework of division. It is about engaging in an honest reflection on who we are as a nation, our institutions, our agencies, our laws, and actually having a conversation that we have failed to have. If you take a look around the globe at places that have struggled, you've got reconciliation commissions in South Africa. You've got in the Rwandan genocide, you've got commissions that address individuals who were engaging in ethnic homicides. We have never sat down and engaged with respect to race. We did it with respect to the internment of Japanese Americans. We are beginning to get there with our indigenous, right, and our Native Americans. We have never had an honest conversation. And in fact, some would say we have been so resistant to that conversation that we have allowed a defeated army to hold on to its symbols of oppression, the Confederate flag, in the very face of this. And why is that so? It is because racism is so embedded that we overlook it to call it something else, to look at heritage and not racism, to engage in that conversation. So I thank you for listening, and I welcome your questions.
Alice Turner, you're unmuted. Do you have a question? No, sorry.
Okay.
Al does.
I,
Plummer.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Dr. Mitchell, my question is, if I wanted to actually read the documents that make up critical race theory, where would I find them?
There are a couple great texts. So this one written by Richard Delgado is a primer, is a critical race theory primer fundamentally. And it was a 2001 where they gather folks together. And since we have an open library, the law school, it's here at our library. That's one of them. There's also two different editions on critical race theory. It's a collection of writings from scholars and activists and together that they have brought them sort of together in these two sort of volumes. I've got another volume here too, Critical Race Theory, The Cutting Edge, second edition. So.
I'll follow with another question if no one else has their hand up right at this point.
I think Al did.
Oh, okay. Then go ahead, Al.
Oh, well, no, go ahead with your follow-up.
Well, what I was going to say was, what can we do to really effectively address all of the nonsense and the vitriol that's out there about critical race theory that people are believing without having any basic knowledge of what it actually is?
Yeah, I mean that's the $1 million question. I mean, I could ask the same question about the science around vaccines right now. People aren't believing that, and that's science, right? Not a theoretical framework. And quite honestly, the noise around this is sort of the, if you will, the CRT discussion is a little bit of sort of Faulkner-esque, right? This is sort of sound and fury signifying nothing, because quite honestly, what this is that this is obfuscation, right? That in the midst, and it's very curious that in the midst of an investigation around January 6th, and individuals who are actually engaged in insurrection, you get this critique of critical race theory as being the division when it's not. And so quite honestly, the key is for individuals like yourselves and others to know the facts about critical race theory such that they can tell people, no, you're wrong. That's not it, right? Critical race theory is not taught in grade schools because it's theoretically, it's above grade school level, right? Now, do I address issues? Now, I used to teach high school history. I taught a class comparing Black protests in the United States and the Caribbean. I teach an alternative class at Douglas. Do I talk about race and issues of that? I certainly do, right? But critical race theory is something more than that. It's beyond that. And quite honestly, this is about racial realism in what we do for our history. This is not about hiding who we are as a nation. And we need to get past that, right? Merely because you critique something doesn't mean that you are somehow blaming individuals, right? No one would say, no one would say that anybody today who was not a white, even though their ancestors may have been, today, no one's a white slaveholder, right? But we need to recognize the fact that there were advantages that were passed on. That's the reality.
Al Plummer, and then Warren Sapp, I think after Al. Go ahead, Al.
Yes, Dr. Mitchell, I am an advocate of critical race theory in its perspective, but yet on the other hand, somewhat frustrated advocate of just generally equal opportunity from the standpoint that it seems we go through phases. You mentioned affirmative action in the state of Missouri, for example. We had one of the best civil rights states acts in the country for a short time, but then a group comes along very much like Reconstruction and Jim Crow and blows up the entire concept to where we almost end up starting all over again from a point at which we're providing kind of an elementary phase to a conversation we should be well beyond. when do we get down the road to where we, I think, make significant impact with these conversations? And as you know only so well, we've got everybody in the hemisphere has a recognition month, and a lot of that is because, very much like Black history or Native Americans or Latinos, we weren't included in the overall perspective of our nation's story, the United States being the nation. Where do we get down the road to where we can actually start? You know, some folks can go through elementary school, graduate to junior high, go to high school, and then maybe on to college. It seems like we're always starting back in elementary school.
Yeah, so you're right. I mean, it's incredibly frustrating and it's incredibly disquieting that we sort of begin these conversations again. So I think my historian colleagues would say history is like a pendulum. It swings back and forth. And right now we are on a movement where it's swinging in the other direction, right? I also think, quite honestly, this is about power, right? So in the aftermath of the last election, the reason why we get voting rights restrictions now is because people saw fundamentally how it can change by grassroots and turnout. So what do? You change the rules of the game, right? I mean, that's a part of American history, right? So you go from slavery, okay, we'll free you, but we'll create Jim Crow. Okay, well, we'll create Jim Crow, but we won't let you vote. Okay, well, we won't let you vote. Well, we will incarcerate you. Oh, well, we'll have affirmative action. Oh, well, we'll repeal that. Well, we won't do that. We'll change the voting rules, right? I mean, so this is about the nature of power itself changing, but it's also about sort of, quite honestly, changing allegiances. And I wrote a guest commentary for the Missourian, which I think there's one thing that's often missing is there's often an allegiance of whiteness that is actually a false allegiance, in the sense that white ethnic groups aren't all the same, and they weren't all treated the same. And when they got to these shores, they didn't all come on the same boat on the same deck, right? But in effect, we have allowed whiteness, and they have allowed whiteness to basically eclipse the very fundamental ethnic differences that existed and that created that, such that it's very easy to parse that out. And now with this notion of the majority becoming the minority numerically, there is a fear of power. This is no different, quite honestly. I think this is becoming, what looks like our American apartheid, right? That this is no difference, where we are now changing the power such that we will reserve power for those who are going to be in the minority numerically in order to address those issues. Unfortunately, Al, I'm a New Yorker. I'm quite pessimistic. I think there are those of us who are always going to be further along in this issue. But I think if we're really going to address this, I think we really have to be seriously consider reparations movements. We really have to consider changing the nature of how we deal with education. And we really have to deal with personal wealth. A colleague at another law school wrote a book, Dorothy Brown wrote a book about the tax code being racialized, right? I mean, when you talk about being able to pass wealth on, that is a fundamental issue of lack of mobility and access. And so that means keeping folks in, right? And we also can't forget what I think is really important is the intersectionality that exists here too, right? That it's about race, but it's also about economic class, right? And so it's looking at pieces together, not sort of independently.
Thank you.
Warren and Annabelle, and then Carl, I think we got hands up. So Warren, Sap. You're muted, Warren.
There we go. All right. Thank you, Professor Mitchell, for your presentation. I really appreciate it and feel informed by it. Ken Butler and Betty and I belong to a religious congregation that says it wants to address racial injustice and create racial justice. So I want to know what your speaking fee is, because I would like to expose an additional 150 people in Colombia to what you just said. And keep that issue in front of us. And being a I know that being a well-informed congregation is not the same as being an active congregation, but we'll take what we can get for now. So I wish what you just said were on a video, because you might just wear yourself out speaking all over Columbia, but I'd like to start with our church.
Well, I think this actually was recorded, but I'm happy to just, if you can send me an email, I'm happy to have that conversation.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, well, I think you'll hear back from Broadway Christian Church. I can't speak for the congregation. I'm not the pastor, I'm not the chairman of the elders, but we'll see what we can do about informing ourselves and about putting that out there. I would like to see some 30-second television commercials aired that speak about this, maybe on ESPN of all places, and that would speak against the white hysteria and the demagoguery about what critical race theory actually is.
So I did write a guest commentary for the Columbia Missourian, which you can share, which is out there about this.
Okay. Well, thank you. Maybe Ken and I will get back to you. I hope.
Okay.
So.
Thank you. Annabelle Simmons, you can unmute yourself, please, and ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, my question is regarding the reparations, and we just got back from the civil rights pilgrimage, and we went to Vernon Church in the Greenwood area of Tulsa, and the pastor there was telling us that after the Civil War, the white slave owners were given reparation of $310 each for the slaves that they lost because of the 13th Amendment being passed. However, the people that did the work over many, many years have never received reparations. And I was wondering, is that an argument that can be used to get reparations for the descendants of those people?
I think it can be. I'm not a reparations scholar. I mean, there are others who I know who have done the work and who do far better in terms of explaining that. But I mean, it's totally the case, right? It's the individuals who were paid money. They were paid money because they quote unquote lost property, right? Which goes to the heart of the fact that there was a lack of recognition of personhood and humanity of the individuals who were freed, and that they were still viewed as property. And quite honestly, we see the same in other places. I mean, the fact that, South Africa changed, right? That it changed in terms of a Black majority becoming in political power, and yet those who own the means of production, the land, still remained in the same hands. And so they changed the political dynamic, but they didn't change the economic framework or structure. So here we changed the nature of the status of African Americans, but we didn't recognize the fact that if you give people or you hold them in bondage for centuries and you say, go be free, have a great time, with no means, no access, right? Then it's very clear that wasn't going to happen, right? And so the idea, and then you get the issue of, well, how do these individuals sort of make a living? It's very easy. And then you create new laws on how to basically re-incarcerate them, right? Make them re-enslave them, right? Because, now they're vagrants because they have no place to live. And so now you do that, or you create convict leasing, which was another form of sort of slavery, just by another name. And so, the reparations movement, I mean, quite honestly, and I find it disingenuous when folks talk about, well, we can't identify who was a descendant in order to basically make reparations, right? Well, then if you can't do individual, then you can do collective or group responses, right? I mean, we responded to the internment of Japanese right? We recognize there were property, we recognize lost property. We have done things to address, if you will, or to ameliorate, if you will, the indigenous Americans. And yet for Black Americans, we seem not to be creative enough for some reason, that we can't do this, right? And if you go back to some of those slave records, they were meticulous about, who they were, at least descriptions were, and family names and so forth. And so if we really put the effort in and we're creative in what we wanted to do and talk about not just the individual impact or the familial impact, but the collective and group impact, then we could actually sort of make this a different sort of prospect of change.
Okay, I think Carl was next, and then Scott Crystal.
Well, thank you, Dr. Mitchell. This was very informative. I offered a couple of references. I'm making the assumption, first of all, that you'd agree that critical race theory is or should simply be, or maybe not so simply, a function of American history. But after making that assumption, I've offered a couple of references in the chat, a book by Adrian Dixon, Critical Race Theory and Education, All God's Children Got a Song, and some national resources to the National League of Cities REAL Council. REAL stands for Race, Equity, and Leadership Council. It was an initiative that was established post-Ferguson in 2015. I became kind of a charter member and have been a member ever since. It's established council status with the National League of Cities. And it last year had a recommendation for a federal committee to study the issue of reparations. And I just want to add one additional point, and that is the City of Columbia is now considering in the budget process a proposal to hire a race, equity, and inclusion officer, which I obviously will support. And in addition, in the last year, we've hired 3 department heads of color. So I think we are making some progress. But anyway, I offer those resources to the folks. And I appreciate your continuing efforts in this conversation. It's vital stuff.
Sure, you're welcome. Yeah, I mean, and I'll just sort of add, I think it's great of hiring a race equity individual. I think it's great of having department heads, but unless the structure is changed, then those are just sort of appointments, right? We had the first Black president for 8 years, and what was accomplished because you had a resistant body of individuals who pushed back. Well, right, and so part of it is changing the framing around it. But yeah,
let me add to that. In the past year as well, I serve as mayor pro tem, and in the past 2 years, we've established a fund, at least a fund, a very modest fund of $100,000 to take a racial equity lens at our entire code of ordinances. And I insisted with that prescription, if you will, that we also not just contract out to some outside firm, or perhaps it would be even to the National League of Cities in this case, but some outside firm, and not include some of the local folks of color who also have a tremendous amount to offer this community. So I think that's in the offing, and you'll see that coming up in the next budget.
That's great.
Scott, did you have a question?
Yes, let my wife ask her.
Oh, cool.
Oh, hi. Marcela Cristian, I'm Scott's wife. And I have lived in this country for 36 years. And throughout my first year of living here, I realized that this was 2 different countries, one for the whites and one for the blacks. And it was, which I come from South America, which you can already figure it out by my accent. So it's very difficult to live in this country. It's almost like you have to have two set of mind to live in this country. But that's, anyway, my question to all of you or to this gentleman is, what can I do in my everyday life? Am I going to shop, taking my children to school, talking to my neighbors, whatever it is that I have to do every single day of my life to avoid being racist, basically, to change my way of thinking, or for myself to not to be seen as a different. I'm from another country. I hear all the time, your accent is so lovely, you are so here, and it's another way to tell me you're different. You don't belong in here. So I don't know if any of you can answer that, or but that's my question or my comment, I should say.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things, quite honestly, is we all need to be very intentional, excuse me, about the biases that we have when we engage our everyday existence. And it means, quite honestly, it's often that pause moment, right? Or that second thought. When you see someone and you have the immediate, oh, this is my first reaction. Well, what is this reaction? Why am I having this reaction? Right? Is it because there is something legitimate about the situation, or is it because of the individual? Right? The circumstances, of all the cases that we've had around the country now with individuals having law enforcement called upon them, they have been in places where they are legally entitled to be, yet people feel as though they're not supposed to be in those places, that they're restricted places fundamentally. And so part of it, so one is being intentional about what we do, about who we see, about how we engage and how we react. The second thing is, quite honestly, is that not being silent, is that when you see an injustice, you have to say something. Because failure to say something basically gives those who are engaging in that act carte blanche or permission, or that you are approving or agreeing with what they're doing. Now, it doesn't mean place yourself in harm's way, right? It could very well mean, oh, you need to engage with someone, if it's in a store, with a supervisor or someone else, but you need to do something, you need to say something. Often you also need to stand in a position to show support for the person who may be being the one who's being victimized or what have you, right? I would hope that if someone was treating my son in a way that was problematic, that someone else, an adult, would stand in and say something. I would hope that if someone was being, victimized, I mean, here's a great example is post 9/11, many of our Muslim brothers and sisters were clearly being targeted. And it were not for people who stood up for them in public spaces and places, they would have been victims of assault and battery and so forth. And so part of it means showing those who disagree that they are the aberration and not the norm, right? And so that's incredibly important. The third thing is, and I think someone mentioned too, is getting involved in the debate and the discussion, right? Our senator is proposing a most ridiculous act, right? Our legislators are engaging in probably the most backwards notion of trying to deny school funding to schools that quote unquote teach critical race theory when they don't. We as communities need to say, no, that is ridiculous. We are not going to stand for that, right? And so being silent is not an option, right? And so it's engaging in those conversations. It's marshaling the forces that we have to basically speak out and speak back against those individuals who are misinformed, who are basically pandering to a mantra, or if you will, of fear, trying to stoke up a base and to try to basically, deflect from some of the real issues that are happening.
Dr. Mitchell, I've got a question. I guess I think we're probably all here in this audience in agreement of there are problems currently that need to be resolved and worked through. What would you say would be the end result would look like? Say, I realize it'll take years to get through this, but say 50 years from now or 100 years from now, what would things look like in this country if everything went perfectly, if we could get over this? How would you describe the country?
How would I describe it? Yeah, David, I think you've actually walked into the fantasy realm. This is that's unfortunately for me, that seems more like Star Wars, all right, where you defeat the evil empire and everybody lives free together and they're all diverse. But to be more serious about it, quite honestly, what it means is that it means engaging in a real racial reckoning, which we have not done. It means looking at the disparity and inequality across gender. It means recognizing what poverty really looks like, right? And it means addressing those issues. And it means addressing the flaws in our system for criminal justice. And so this is not a sort of one-pronged or simple answer approach, right? Because the moment you sort of change, you turn one dial, something else gets affected, right? Like I said, so I do work on the criminal justice system, and I'm often told, because there are so many discretionary points in the system is not racist or biased, right? And that is totally untrue. At the end of the day, if you look at the disparity rates of who's incarcerated, if you look at the disparity rates of who's arrested, it's clear that there is an impact that exists there. our rules and our structure says that it's not because we've set them up that way. But the reality is quite clear. So it means attacking the system in a critical way that seeks to address equality and what true equality means, right? And true equality doesn't mean, true equality is this notion of we all have the same equal opportunities to do what we need to do. And, and some of that starts right now with folks who are addressing the issues of the tax code, right? Someone who makes $1 billion paying far less than someone who makes $30,000 is ridiculous, right? Now, folks would say, oh my God, this guy's a socialist. No, he's not a socialist. What he's saying is paying one's fair share, right? I mean, the lessons we all learn in kindergarten, right? Oh, it's your fair share, right? That's sort of what it is. We all pitch in to take care of the infrastructure, the things around us. That's not being socialistic. That's being democratic, right? That's sort of
saying, we're having a conversation that is a difficult conversation for citizens all over America. It's not a new conversation. It's one that has been a part of the American conversation for most.
Carl, are you listening to something, Carl?
But it's one that we must have in America, and it's one that we must have in.
Oh, my apologies. I was looking for something. I got my mic on. I'm
sorry. No worries. Yeah, so David, the simple answer to your question is, look, 50 years ago, my parents walked with King. We're at the March on Washington, and they said, oh, when we're done with this, we will have arrived as a nation, right? My kids won't face the same things that I faced. And that's not true. I was born, right? We had our first Black president. I haven't said this, but folks say, oh, we've arrived, we are at the end, and there's no need to carry on. That's not true. And the reason it's not true is because it is embedded and inherent in our DNA of our nation, right? And so part of that means, quite honestly, going to the heart of that and extracting that and addressing it at the root and the cause level, right? And quite honestly, that's going to be cognitive dissonance for a whole lot of people. Because what you are telling them is, for some, you didn't get this by your own. You basically stood on somebody else's shoulders to be here, right? And that's very unsettling, right? To tell someone you have an advantage when you don't think you had an advantage at all. And so that's one aspect. The reverse aspect of it also is that you don't cripple people by saying to them that you are a victim all the time, right? You've got to give folks the tools to be successful, right? But that means the real tools to be successful, not the sort of, oh, let's engage in sort of the window dressing tools of success, right? Like we tell people, oh, be entrepreneurs, but then we make licensing expensive and too hard to do for them to, and regulations that they can't sort of adhere to, right? And so and unfortunately, you're talking about unpacking and unweaving a lot of stuff that's interlocking, right?
Very good. Well, I guess our time is about up. Do we have any other questions real quick before we leave? I'm looking for hands. We have a very large audience today. I appreciate everyone. Well, Warren, your hand is still up. Was that from before, or did you have another question? Nope, nothing else. Annabelle, your hand's up. I didn't notice if there was something else. Pam?
I'd just like to make a comment in that whenever something really positive happens, like when Obama became president, there's a backlash. And I guess we should just accept it because that's what's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, the backlash is quite simple, right? People do not want to willingly give up power.
That's right.
And that is not critical race theory. That's as old as time.
Right. Well, thank you, Dr. Mitchell.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I think our time is up today. Thank you again, Dr. Mitchell, for being here, and for all of our audience. We appreciate a large turnout today. Very good. Glad so many of you were able to make it. Some others came in after we made introductions, but I see several names and faces I don't recognize. So thank you all for being here. We'll be back next week when our guest again will be, I wrote it down, but I can't read my handwriting.
It's Melissa Schulte from Aging Best.
I didn't put my glasses on. I can't read my handwriting. Speak from Aging Best. Thank you, Pam, for helping me out there.